Father, your son offered himself as King of the Jews, but 4 days later he was cut off at Calvary, rejected by his own people. Today we wait for his return to claim his bride, the church. Your plan for Israel was set aside during this church age, that you will return and focus on Israel once more to fulfill your promise. And the first 69 sevens that Daniel has talked about have been literally fulfilled, and you've decreed one more bundle of 7 years for your people Israel, when the temple will be rebuilt. And at first Israel will be deceived by the beast when he proclaims himself to be God. In the end, your people will return to you. May all your people turn to you and walk faithfully with you for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, last week we covered God's purposes for those 77s, the 70 weeks, and that was the answer to Daniel's prayer. We saw in verse 25 how the first 69 of those sevens were literally fulfilled to the very day. And then we talked about why Jesus wept at the triumphal entry. So today we're turning to Daniel 9 and verse 26 about the prophesied events that will happen after that 69th seven. So these are things happening after the triumphal entry of Jesus. I'll read now Daniel 9, verse 26. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. We talked last time how the conservative Bible scholars agree this word for anointed one, it means Messiah or Christ. It's the one who has been anointed by God as the King of Kings. And that person, Jesus Christ, was cut off, and that happened at Calvary. So the Hebrew word for cut off there, you'll see it several places in the Old Testament. Genesis 9, Isaiah 53, Jeremiah 11, and it means a violent death. It's the same Hebrew word that they would use for a penalty, a death penalty execution for criminals. And we know that Christ's own people rejected him. They welcomed him with palm branches and hosannas on the triumphal entry, and then 4 days later, he had been rejected and crucified. So it's the greatest tragedy we see in all of history that the Son of God is cut off from life. He's forsaken during those last 3 hours on the cross. Mark 15, Psalm 22 describe that. And the part about having nothing, the anointed one would have nothing in the sense that he was rightfully to be the king on David's throne, but he did not receive that position when he was here in the earthly ministry 2,000 years ago. And we talked about what happens between the 69th and the 70th week. Do they happen one after another? Is there a gap? If there is a gap after that 69th seven, then the 70th seven could still be in the future, not yet fulfilled. And that's my belief. That's what I'm teaching, because I believe that's what the Bible tells us. So the 69 weeks began with a major event. That was the decree that Nehemiah received to go back and rebuild. And the 69 weeks ended with a major event there on the triumphal entry when Jesus rode in on the donkey. The 70th week, that ends with the second coming. That's the return of Christ. And so following that pattern, it stands to reason that the 70th week would begin with a major event. And that's the one that we call the rapture. We're living in a gap right now between the 69th and 70th week, and that gap we call the church age began at Pentecost. And so the event that will end this gap and begin the 70th seven is the rapture of the church. And then that 70th week becomes the tribulation that the Apostle John describes in Revelation. So there's several significant events happening in between the 69th week and the 70th week. In the first bullet there, the Messiah would be cut off, the time when he was deserted, forsaken, mocked, and that was fulfilled in 33 AD. Last week we talked about the actual date, April 3rd of 33 AD at 3 p.m. when the Messiah was cut off on the cross. And then the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary of the temple would be destroyed. That was fulfilled by the Roman army in 70 AD, and that was 37 years after Calvary. So Jerusalem and the temple, we know they were rebuilt during the 100 years after Daniel. That was the time period of Ezra, and then Nehemiah went back to rebuild the city. But then both the city of Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed again. And that happens after the crucifixion of Christ. So the Messiah, these verses tell us he was going to come before this destruction, and therefore he came before 70 AD. The Messiah had to come before the Roman army destroyed the temple again. And then since that destruction in 70 AD, Israel has experienced a lot of trouble, as we've seen in our lifetime. War and desolation, the fact that the temple has not existed since 70 AD, so they've had no place for the formal Jewish worship and the sacrifices. Verse 26 that we're studying today, this indicates that the time of trouble and desolation and war for Israel is going to continue until the consummation of that 70th week. So you have the end of the 70th seven. We'll study that next week in verse 27. That will be the second coming of Christ. But you have this period of time from 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple until 1948 when Israel was reestablished. The Jews were scattered. The nation of Israel had ceased to exist. And then it's partially regathered now. You have a nation of Israel, you have borders, but not all the Jews are regathered there. And they're certainly not worshiping Jesus as their Messiah. So during this gap, the period between the 69th setting and the 70th setting, God's program for Israel has been set aside. And that's a temporary thing. We see it in Matthew 16. Jesus talks about the church, Matthew 21, Acts 15. And during this period, during the gap, the people of Israel, the Jewish believers that have not received Christ, they had this like a partial blindness or a hardening in part. And so that's Romans chapters 9 through 11, especially Romans 11:25, where Paul talked about the hardening until the full number of the Gentiles come in. And at that point, then they will receive their Messiah. But it explains how you take a Jewish believer and they can look at Isaiah 53, and we're looking at the same verses. It's obvious to us that it's talking about Jesus, the Messiah, but to them, they can't see it. Just for some reason, it's not clear to them. And there's this partial hardening that makes it difficult for them to receive him since he was rejected 2,000 years ago. Joseph, in the Old Testament, this is toward the closing chapters of Genesis, when Joseph was in Egypt. He was not accepted until his second coming. You remember that the brothers rejected him. He was sold off into slavery. He was in prison. And then he rises to become second only to the Pharaoh, second in command. And he's helping the area to get through the famine. And so Egypt has food when no one else does. So then the brothers and the father come, Jacob comes to Egypt. And then he is accepted at that point. You had the picture of Moses back in the time of Exodus. He was rejected initially, and then he was finally accepted as their leader to take them out of bondage. So those are pictures. Joseph and Moses are Old Testament pictures of Christ and in what will happen when he is accepted, when he comes again at the second coming. Now, Roman army general Titus came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but he ordered that the temple would be left intact. His direction was for the soldiers not to destroy the temple. So according to the historians, it was an accident. And what they say happened is that one of the soldiers dropped a torch and it caught one of the tapestries on fire. And before they could extinguish it, it spread through the temple. And now the whole temple's on fire. So that's how the Jewish temple was destroyed. And it was filled with all kinds of gold decorations where they'd taken these thin sheets of gold and put gold leaf over so many of the decorations. The heat from the fire melted that gold leaf, and it flowed down to the floor and went into the cracks on the floor between the stones. After that, whenever the ashes cooled off, the soldiers went back in and they pulled up those floor stones to get the gold that was in between the cracks. And that was referring back to what Jesus predicted in Matthew 24. Jesus said that when the temple is destroyed, not one stone would be left on another, but they would all be pulled up and thrown aside. So that was fulfillment of his prophecy. But if the 70th week did come immediately after the 69th, those last 7 years would have started in 33 AD, right when Jesus came in at the triumphal entry. And that means that the 70th week would have ended in the year 40 AD. So that destruction in 70 AD would have been 30 years too late. And we know that God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't miscalculate. He's been literally true to the very day on several prophecies that we've seen. So the destruction of that temple, it has to happen either before the 70th week or during the 70th week. It cannot happen after the 70th week. And that's where we say that there must be some kind of gap between the 69th and 70th. According to this, it would have to be a gap of at least 30 years. And what I'm saying is that we're still living in that gap, that it's around 2,000 years so far, and the gap will not end until Christ returns for its bride at the rapture. When we talk about the people of the ruler who will come, these are the people from the Roman Empire. Jesus talked about that some in Matthew 24. And the ruler who will come is going to be this final Roman world ruler that we refer to as the Antichrist. Back when we studied Daniel chapter 7, Daniel 7 verse 8 talked about him as the little horn. So the most consistent way that we can interpret this verse 26 is that all of it has been fulfilled in the past. That there was the destruction fulfilled by the Roman army. Titus and that group came in 70 AD. And people don't realize how many of the Jews were killed during that destruction. It was not just the city, not just the temple, but the army during that invasion killed 5 million Jews in 70 AD. And that's almost as many as were killed during the Nazi Holocaust. That Hitler's executions took 6 million Jews during that time. So this destruction in 70 AD, it's a foreshadowing. It's something that already happened, and yet it also predicts what will happen when the Antichrist comes and desecrates the temple during the tribulation. So now we're turning to the back of the handout, page 82, and I wanted to look at the comparison of how the 70th week is described by three different authors in Scripture. We have the Olivet Discourse. This is in Matthew chapter 24. It's also in Mark 13, Luke 21. And that Olivet Discourse by Jesus, it's really the key for us to understand verse 27 next week. So this is all preparation or background for next week. Olivet Discourse talks about this period of time. And then verse 27, Daniel 9:27 next week, talks about the same period of time. And as you read the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 6 through 18 also describe this time in more detail. So Daniel describes the 70th week just in one verse. Next week, the end of chapter 9. Jesus expanded that to one chapter and described it in Matthew 24. Apostle John describes it in 13 chapters in much greater detail about what will happen. So we'll look now at what Daniel said and what Jesus said and what John said about the 70th week. In Daniel, this is verse 27, and this is from commentator Clarence Larkin, describes some of these details. Daniel talked about the second coming, the return of Christ, in chapter 7. And I give you some verses there, 11 through 14, 25, and 26. But when you get to the 7-year tribulation, the 70th week, the first half of that period, first 3.5 years, is where the Antichrist makes this covenant. It's a peace treaty with Israel, and it's an agreement that they will be allowed to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, right beside this mosque, the Dome of the Rock that is there today. And then in the middle of that time, when the construction on the temple is completed, after those 3.5 years, Antichrist will break his covenant with Israel, and he will cause them to cease their sacrifices. He will enter the temple, and he will set up his image, and he will proclaim himself to be God. 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about that. And then after that event, those last 3.5 years in the tribulation, this is where the temple would be desolate until the end. So the Jewish believers will not be worshiping the beast there in the temple any longer. They will flee. And then the way Jesus describes it, this is in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. The second coming is right toward the end of the chapter, verses 29 through 31. But earlier in that chapter, he talks about the first half of the tribulation. And there will be wars, there'll be famines, earthquakes, persecution, death and hate and false prophets and deception. He talks about what would be the characteristics of that time. And then in the middle, this is in Matthew 24, starting at verse 15. In the middle of the 7 years, he says, when the abomination, that was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, the abomination and desolation is set up in the temple, that will be the indication for the Jews to flee. And then he goes on to describe the last half, the 3.5 years of just terrible tribulation or distress. And he describes it as the worst time in history, that in the past or in the future, there will never be a time as terrible as that last half of the tribulation. And then we come to John's revelation, and I back up to get a running start. You begin at the first verse in chapter 5, and really continuing on through the tribulation into chapter 19, where Jesus returns. That's the wedding supper of the Lamb, and then the return of Christ to the Mount of Olives. So he described the second coming, John did in Revelation 19. And then the first half of the tribulation is a 3.5 year period where he describes the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments. In the middle, the Revelation chapter 12, where the devil, the dragon, is cast down to the earth. He possesses the body of the Antichrist, the world leader. And then the last half, starting in chapter 13, those 3.5 years is the Great Tribulation, but the worst of those 7 years, the 7 bowl judgments. So where I wanted to wrap up today is, how does all this relate to our faith? What's the practical application for us as believers today? There was an article from this Christian school over in Nigeria. The title was, "Can Faith Protect Me from the Events of the End Times?" And the middle chapters here in Revelation, talking about chapter 6 through 18, I put unsettling. That's really an understatement. It's deeply disturbing. It's terrifying. And we've talked about that some. The devil wants us to be paralyzed with fear. He wants to cripple our testimony. He wants us to just go hide under the bed and wait for Jesus to come back and not tell anybody, not share the gospel, not live as people of faith. But God is our refuge. God is our strength. And we talked some on Wednesday night. Chuck was reading from Psalm 46. We talked about the sons of Korah. And you remember the story back in number 16, where the earth opened and swallowed up Korah and his people. But God in his grace preserved a remnant. And those sons of Korah went on to write several of the Psalms, including verse 46. And so that's the verse. The whole Psalm of 46 was the basis for the text. And Martin Luther's hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." But it's having that strong, deep faith in God. And so we're able to trust God even during the worst storm. You remember how the disciples were out on the boat, and that terrible storm came along, and Jesus spoke, and the wind stopped, and the waves stopped. He is in control. Another illustration of that is the 10 bridesmaids, and this is where Jesus went in Matthew 25. Right after he described the tribulation, he talked about being prepared, staying ready spiritually, so that you don't have to get ready when Jesus comes. You'll be ready. And we do this today by supporting one another. We pray for one another. We care for one another. We encourage one another. It's an interesting study sometimes just to look up all of those one another verses in the New Testament. all the things that we're called to do for one another as a community of faith, and there's our church family. But we do this by living a life that matters in terms of God's glory. We live for Him. And the several verses I gave you about that from Ephesians and Colossians and Philippians and Thessalonians. But we're shining this light of Christ, and God is using our life to draw others to Christ through the testimony of the strong faith that we demonstrate. And so I've said from the beginning, the book of Daniel is unlike any other book. Daniel shows us that God is in control, and it's just so clear, so obvious in Daniel. And because God is in control, we can live without fear. It's not that we're strong, it's not that we're brave or courageous, it's that God is in control, the all-powerful, all-knowing God. Every day, each of us, we're putting our faith in things that might let us down or disappoint us, things that may not be trustworthy. So I give you some examples there. We step into elevators, or we drive across bridges. The food that we eat, we're assuming that it's safe and not poison. Medicine that we take, other people, we put our trust in other people to do what they said they would do, but sometimes they disappoint us. And so what Jesus tells us in Mark 11:22, have faith in God. Your faith is not in other people. Your faith is not in the bridge. Your faith is not in the food or the medicine. And certainly your faith is not in yourself. Your faith is in God alone. That's the key point. There's no safer place that we can put our faith than to trust in God. And faith is like a muscle. It gets stronger as you exercise it, as you use your faith day by day. So it's important for us to exercise our faith. And it matters, first of all, because God, it's impossible to please God without faith. But then if we fail to trust God each day as we go along, each step of our life, our faith gets weaker, and it becomes easier for Satan to deceive us and to lead us away. Our neighbors are not able to see our faith. What they see is our action. They see what we do. And are we living in a way, or are we doing things and saying things that indicate to our neighbors that we trust in God? Are we living by faith? Are we living as if we truly believe what the Bible says? That God is the only one who's worthy of trust, because he can't lie, he can't break his promises. And we've seen how they literally come true. So I give you an illustration here that the daredevil up at Niagara Falls, and he's drawing a crowd, and he's got a tight rope stretched across the waterfront, and he says to the crowd, who believes that I can push this wheelbarrow across the waterfall on this tightrope? And all the crowd is cheering, and they say, yes, yes, we believe, we believe. And so then he says, who will get in the wheelbarrow and go with me? That's the trust. That's the full confidence. So God doesn't want us to live in fear. He doesn't want us to go through life with our fingers crossed and hoping that somehow the Bible is true and hoping that Jesus may return someday. He wants us to be fully confident in Him, not in anything else. And God, in His mercy, He didn't have to do this, but He's proven to us that He is trustworthy. He's demonstrated that through the fulfilled prophecy. And so, closing question that I want you to consider today, I've shared this once before, but this was from Del Tackett that led the Truth Project at Focus on the Family. And he said, do you really believe that what you believe is really real? Do you really believe that what you believe is really real? So next week, we're going to finish chapter 9. We'll focus on verse 27, the 70th 7. That will happen in the future, and that's when God is ready for the temple to be rebuilt. And we'll discuss why it's important for us to study these 70 books. I'll give you a clue here. The reason it's important to study the 77s is that it reveals to us who Jesus is. So I hope to see you next week.